Okay, we're going to continue on with our discussion of religion. One thing about religion that is important to note is that religion is what anthropologists call a cultural universal. That is, there are no human societies, past, present, and presumably future, that don't have some form of religion. Now, there aren't very many cultural universals. There aren't very many things that are found in all human societies. And the ones that are found are very basic fundamental things like language, rules for kinship and sex, who you can or can't have sex with, rules for when you can or can't use violence, some form of social stratification or inequality. These things are common to all societies, and they're very basic, just like religion is very basic. So must have a very important job to do, or it wouldn't be found in every society. Now, religions have some common elements. And the ones that we're going to look at are, number one, religions have some sort of institutionalized system for dealing with the supernatural, the gods, the spirits, the unseen realm. And this institutionalized system is usually done through ritual behavior and incantations, things like that. Number two, religions have some sort of code of conduct or some sort of moral system that members of a particular community adhere to. And number three, it is usually, but not always, concerned with some sort of existence after death. Now, how long has religion been around? Well, anthropologists have speculated that it is at least as old as humanity. And some anthropologists have looked at archaeological evidence and argued that Neanderthals had religion. Now, Neanderthals and human beings are two different kinds of hominid species who descend from a common ancestor. So they're not our ancestor. They're a descendant from a common ancestor. They're our cousins. And some people have argued that Neanderthals had religion. And if Neanderthals had religion, then that would mean that they must have got it from our common ancestor. And so religion would be older than humanity. Now, what is the evidence that Neanderthals had religion? Well, one of the things that we see is that Neanderthals very carefully buried their dead. And you have people buried, and Neanderthal people buried in caves with things like meat and tools, where it looks like the deceased has been provisioned. And given the harshness of life and the lack of surplus, why would you waste meat and tools on the dead? Why would you provision the dead? And some archaeologists have speculated it's because the idea is that death isn't the end, that you're going to exist after you're dead, and you might need an axe, and you might need some food for whatever journey you're about to go on. And this is evidence that the Neanderthals have some sort of notion of a spiritual existence. Now, this is very controversial. Some people argue that the burials could have been for hygienic reasons, and that the meat and artifacts that are found with the bodies could have been garbage carried out with the corpse. I mean, if you have a bounteous hunt, you probably can't, you don't have a refrigerator, some of the meat that you have will be spoiled to the point where you can't eat it, and your broken axe might go into the garbage pile along with the dead body of your friend Og. So it could be sheer coincidence that the dead are buried with other objects, and it's as likely that the dead have been provisioned as it is that the dead were thrown on a garbage heap. Also, cave bears and Neanderthals have shared the same caves, and archaeological evidence has shown cave bear remains along with Neanderthal evidence of Neanderthal culture, and that's where you could get a mixing up of bones from the prey from the bears with Neanderthal bodies. Now, the most compelling evidence of Neanderthal afterlife or burial of the dead is from a place in the Zagros Mountains in Iraq. And according to pollen samples, a buried Neanderthal man was buried with several species of flower. In other words, his body was adorned with flowers. And here's a quote from the report on this. Quote, "From the orderly distribution of grains around the fossil remains, there is no question that the flowers were arranged deliberately. It did not simply topple into the grave, as believed, as the body was being covered." So, in other words, that you have a funeral going on here. You have some sort of respect for the dead. But does being buried with flowers imply religious thinking? Does it imply some sort of afterlife? I mean, you can be sad and miss someone and want to put flowers on their body without believing that they've gone on to some other place. Still, the modern humans like us, early modern humans, later people, have mortuary practices that are similar to the Neanderthal, but that clearly demonstrate religious thinking. So among early modern humans who were contemporaries of Neanderthals in Europe and the Middle East, there are clear burials where the dead person has been clearly provisioned. You see situations where high status individuals have been buried with their pets and with their servants. That would be bad, where you die and because you might be needing your servants in the next life, they slay your servants and bury them with you along with your pets. Because these early modern human burials look quite a bit like the Neanderthal burials, only they're more advanced, the idea is that maybe early modern humans, what we call Cro-Magnon men, had, since they had religion, maybe the Neanderthals had a rudimentary form. But the jury's still out on whether or not the Neanderthals actually had religion, or whether our kind is the only animal known to have religion. So take that for what it's worth. Now, why is religion a cultural universal, at least among Homo sapiens? What is it for? How did it begin? And we have some ideas about the origins of religion. And there are a variety of different explanations. The first are what we call natural knowledge explanations. The second is that dreams and shadows and altered states served as the forerunners of religious thought. There are some explanations from the discipline of evolutionary psychology. There's some notion that magical thinking was institutionalized. And there is an idea that supernatural beings have things that we want that we can't get from anybody else. And so we developed a system of exchange with them. Now let me go through each of these in turn. The first is this idea of the natural knowledge of God. And this was a theory espoused by early anthropologists and philosophers who say that religion is a universal because it was revealed by God. And the religious diversity we see today constitutes an apostasy from the original religion that was given to Adam and Eve. And this is, I don't know if you can read this, but if you have high resolution or you've got a large screen, this is from Paul's epistle to the church in Rome in the New Testament. And Paul says, quote, "They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks." So the idea is that, just look around, open your eyes. The existence of God and true religion is completely obvious. And the religious diversity that we see, according to these early thinkers, who were all coming out of a Christian tradition, is this notion that present-day religion constitutes apostasy from the original form. Now, this is a theological view and not a social science view, and you won't be surprised to hear that modern social scientists don't think too much of this theory. And one of the reasons why is because if the existence of God is obvious, then why are there so many different religions? Here is just a small sampling of the many holy books that are available from different religions around the world. And let's say that let's examine this idea that the existence of God or the existence of true religion is obvious as a hypothesis. Ask yourself, if you're a Christian, which is the dominant religion in Jacksonville, Florida, why are you a Christian? And I think in many respects the answer to that question is you are a Christian partly because you were born a Christian and live in a Christian nation. If we built a time machine and took you back to the day of your birth and we switched you with a baby in a hospital in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, chances are you would be a Muslim. And you would be a Muslim because you were born a Muslim and raised a Muslim and you live in a Muslim society. So part of the reason why you are the religion you are, part of the reason why your religion seems manifestly and obviously true to you is because it's, this is the kind of the default option. I'm from Utah, and the Mormons dominate Utah. And what I find interesting about the difference between the evangelical South and Mormon Utah is that the form of religion is very similar, sort of strict ascetic Christianity, but the Mormons are absolutely sure that their religion is true and that all others are false. And evangelical Christians are likewise absolutely sure. But these are different beliefs. And so most anthropologists would say that the natural knowledge view is a little bit problematic, because if it's so obvious, then why is there so much disagreement? Not many sociologists subscribe to the natural knowledge view, but some take a different tack. Some latch on to the first piece and they say that people assume some sort of supernatural creator or supernatural being because they examine the earth and all of its beauty and all of its awe, and they recognize that there are forces that are beyond our control and beyond our comprehension, and that these evince some sort of builder or designer. Many basic religions worship aspects of nature. The sun, for instance, is the most worshipped object throughout human history. One of the things that we see is that revelation or visions from God are often imparted on a mountaintop out in nature. In the New Testament, Jesus conquers Satan, resists Satan's temptation on a mountaintop. Moses goes to the top of Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments. And in many respects, we still sort of commune with nature. We get in touch with our spiritual side in nature. In Mormonism, the founding vision of God that Joseph Smith, the prophet Joseph Smith, had was a vision that came out in the woods in a grove of trees. So, and this is where intelligent design as a corollary to Darwinian evolution comes in. It's an argument for God or religion based on awe and reverence. But does having awe and reverence necessarily denote the existence of something supernatural? I don't know. Even in non-religious ways, we ascribe sentience to nature. We talk about Mother Nature, for instance. So these natural knowledge theories are interesting, but they are not where present lines of inquiry are. Some people have argued that the impetus for religious thinking comes from the idea of dreams. In a lot of languages, including English, sleep is a euphemism for death. In the casket, Grandpa is sleeping, or you go on to your eternal rest, or the metaphor. Metaphorical connection between sleep and death is pretty obvious. In fact, people who are workaholics often use the trite little aphorism, "I'll sleep when I'm dead," to make this point explicit. And in many languages, this is true. And one of the things that happens is when you are asleep, your body is inert, but your mind continues to wander. We have great adventures while we're asleep in our dreams. And if our inert body is active when we're asleep, if our mind is active and our body is inert when we're asleep, then maybe when we're dead, our mind is permanently unleashed from our body. So it's pretty easy to generalize from sleep to death and come up with the idea of some sort of a soul or some sort of a ethereal, non-corporeal existence that persists beyond the grave. And things like shadow and spirit and ghost and soul, many of these words are also linguistically related in many languages. You can also have things like dreams when you have altered states. Because you are versed in science, you know that if you eat psilocybin mushrooms, the hallucinations that you have come from altering your brain chemistry. But if you didn't know what brains were for, or even what brains were, and someone told you if you eat these mushrooms, it's a gateway to another world, or it's a gateway to the realm of the gods, and you ate the mushrooms, well, then you'd believe it. To this day, a lot of people will talk about deeply profound religious experiences that they had under the influence of psychedelics. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Computer, spoke a lot about how LSD shaped his view of the world. The neuroscientist Sam Harris talks about how profound psychedelics were to his thinking. And this was probably true for ancient tribal peoples who ate mushrooms or smoked peyote or opium. And all of these things, this kind of drug use, has been tied to shamanic religious practice. And there are other ways to have altered states of consciousness as well that induce religious thinking. In the religion that I was raised in, on the first Sunday of every month, you fast. You go without food. And fasting and the asceticism of fasting can produce altered states. In Islam, there's a month of fasting, Ramadan, where you don't eat until the sun goes down, and people report lots of powerful spiritual experiences because what they're doing is altering their brain chemistry. So this comes from altered states, from dreams, from drugs, from other ritual practices. Right? Evolutionary psychologists talk about the origin of religion as something that comes from a byproduct of adaptations that humans developed for living communally. Now remember, religion is a cultural universal. Every human society has it, and when something is universal, evolutionary psychologists typically assume that we've evolved the capacity for it. And so we have evolved the capacity for religion. And so what these psychologists say is that to examine the evolutionary origin of something, you look at its most basic form. So if you want to look at the evolutionary origins of life, what you would do is look at single-celled organisms, because single-celled organisms came first, and invertebrates and mammals and higher forms of life evolved from these single-celled organisms. So what is the sort of single-celled organism of religion? I mean, Catholicism and Judaism and Islam, these are advanced products of thousands of years of cultural evolution. What was the beginning? What's the single-celled organism of religion? And here the first inklings of religious thinking are to be found in the most primitive kinds of society. Thousands of years before Mesopotamia, thousands of years before the pyramids in ancient Egypt, in the provincial pre-scientific life of hunter-gatherers. And remember, we talked at length about hunting and gathering societies, the type of society that human beings were evolved to live in. And if you want, you can go back and review the video lecture on the nature of hunting and gathering societies. It might help you understand this section of our discussion of religion. Bands of around 100 and 150 people, semi-nomadic over an amorphous territory, foraging for food. And this was the way hunter-gatherers lived, and this was 100% of the population for 90% of human history. So human beings like us have been around for at least 150,000 years, and agriculture wasn't developed until at the earliest 10,000 years ago. So for 90% of human history, literally, we were all foragers. And this is the context in which religion originated. Not your religion, whatever your religion is, but the single-celled organism religion, the original religion. Now recall, earlier in the semester, we noted that the size of primate groups is correlated with brain size. Because when you live in social groups, you have to keep track of social relationships, and this requires a lot of thinking. You have to know the personalities of the people in your group. You have to understand the people in your group. So humans are social animals, and we have larger groups, and so we have larger brains. And so to survive, we have to be able to accurately navigate complex social situations. We learned in the social psychology and socialization unit that we have to learn to see things from other people's perspective. We have to learn to read the emotional states of other people. If you want to deceive someone, which is something people do, you have to think about what they know, and you have to understand them so that you can think about what they will believe. It's important to be able to determine the motives behind other people's actions. It's very important in social life to know the difference between being kicked and being tripped over. And psychologists call this the theory of mind, the idea that you can get into the mind of the other, the idea that you can imagine what other people are thinking, that you can look at the world from their perspective and think like they think and know what they know. And we can interact with minds without bodies there. I can think, for instance, what my mother might think of something I do, or I can interact with someone in a dream and have a conversation with someone in a dream. And so we come up with this notion that minds are immaterial and they don't need bodies to exist. You can easily get into the mind of a fictional character, what someone in a movie would or wouldn't do in a particular situation. Right? So from here, this idea that minds don't need bodies to exist, from here it's a short leap to the notion of ascribing minds to other forces that seem to have purposeful action. Nature seems to act in orderly ways that imply consciousness. The movement of heavenly bodies, the sun and the moon crossing the sky, the tides moving in and out. This implies some sort of purposive action. And if there's purposive action, then we need to discern the motives behind this action. And you can see this very common among tribal peoples. So there's a wedding ceremony about to take place where, the chief of tribe A, his son is marrying the daughter of the chief of tribe B. And just as the wedding is about to begin, a powerful storm comes up and scuttles the ceremony. Now, why would that storm come up right then when we were about to have this wedding? Do the spirits object to the wedding? What could be the reason for the storm? Because human beings, want to ascribe motive to action. People began to ascribe motive to things like storms or tornadoes or lightning and thunder and things like that. This is called anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is the notion of imposing human characteristics on nature or inanimate objects. In the socialization lecture, we talked about how you have a facial recognition module in your brain where you can see faces where faces aren't even there. You can't not see faces when you look at these inanimate objects. And not only can you see the faces, but you can discern the emotional state of those faces, right? The razor is worried. The kayak is outraged. The gray plugs are angry. So you can read the emotions of inanimate objects, and that's because your brain is built to, recognize action and discern motive, or see a face and discern the emotional state of that face. This is one a student gave me that I really like. Does anybody own one of these? A little battery charger for your phone, for when your battery runs out. You can put it in your pocket or your purse and charge your battery, right? Everybody, you want to see something painful? Look at this. You can't not see a screaming face with something poking it in the eyeball. Your brain is designed to anthropomorphize. Your brain is designed to make inanimate things sentient. And that's where you get the idea of constellations. You see the stars move, what sort of community is going on in the sky. And you can easily see how this might work in a tribal setting. These various trees at various points in our territory are sentient, and they're trying to tell us something, or they're marking a boundary or something like that. It wouldn't take long to conclude that some of these supernatural agents are extraordinarily powerful and aren't to be trifled with. I might get mad at the people in my village if I think I've suffered an injustice, but I can't whip up a storm that will level our dwellings. And so, these supernatural agents are serious business. As an aside, do people still ascribe motives behind natural events? Sure they do. I remember a prominent televangelist saying that Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was a punishment for the fact that the city of New Orleans tolerated homosexuality. In the 80s, people said that AIDS was a punishment associated with homosexuality. So people still sort of see these kinds of things, do these kinds of things. And so from here we can easily see the origin of sacrifice and rituals that are designed to placate supernatural powers. And we also see the incentive for people who step forward and claim to have a special ability to discern the will of the supernatural powers. There's a market here. Well, you're always trying to discern the motives of the spirits, but I know what they want. And, if you give deference to me, I'll be spokesman for the divine. There is a market here, right? The supernatural powers want me to tell you that the community should build me a better hut. And this is where anthropologists believe that priests come from. People that are sort of moral entrepreneurs or religious entrepreneurs that can discern the will of the gods. From here we can see the origin of supernatural agents that have an interest in humanity, and the supernatural can set the boundaries of our behavior and our morality. It's very functional because even if others in our band don't catch me stealing, the supernatural agents always will, and there will always be a punishment, right? If you cheat on an exam, your professor might not catch you, but God sees you cheat. So if you can be convinced that cheating is a sin in addition to a rule infraction, then you're going to be a lot less likely to cheat. It seems like the gods always want to constrain those who seek to maximize their self-interest in ways that jeopardize the group. And that is why things like stealing and adultery are always wrong. Chimpanzee societies are incredibly unstable because chimps fight over who's going to be the alpha male. And these societies are roiled. Anytime, the alpha male loses a fight and someone else becomes the alpha male, the whole regime changes. That's a lot of instability. Humans solved that problem by putting the alpha male in the sky. And that's how we start getting to religions like ours. But there is one more element to this. Once we have these supernatural beings that have motives and ideas and plans, we realize that they can do things for us that other humans can't do. Right? There are things we want that other people can provide, but there are other things that we want that only the gods can provide. I want to know what's going to happen in the future. I want to live beyond the grave. Like, those are things that no human can grant me, but things that I desperately want. And so people developed institutionalized systems of exchanging with the supernatural, where you give them things and then they give you back what only they can provide. Salvation, healing, things like that. Have you ever tried to strike a bargain with God? It's pretty common. Sacrifice, or doing away with something, sacrificing an animal, sometimes human sacrifice. These are all ways to sort of placate the gods, or to ask the gods for things. One of the most important things that religion asks the gods for is dealing with death. And many people have argued that the fear of death is the essence of religion. I always tell students that I think that contemplating death is like staring at the sun. I mean, you can look at the sun for a few seconds, but then you got to shield your eyes because you just can't stare at it. And contemplating your own death is the same way. And this is the notion of living forever is solely the province of religion. There's no conflict with science here. Your psychiatrist can't help you. You can't go to your psychiatrist and say, I'm paralyzed by the fear of death. And the psychiatrist says, don't worry, I've got, take this medicine and you won't die. You are going to die. And there's nothing science can do for you. And that is why people will always, as long as people are going to die, and as long as people are afraid of death, people are always going to turn to religion. So, because it's got, whether or not the answers you can investigate whether or not they're true, the very fact that it offers means that there'll be some takers. So these are ideas about the origin of religion that you can go through these and think about how they are discussed in the reading as well.